Greetings and welcome, everybody. My name's Donna Stewart, and I am part of Take Part, the Portland Anti-Racism team. We're so excited to see everybody here, and we are particularly honored to be hosting Dr. Markisha Smith this evening. Dr. Smith is the director of the Office of Equity and Human Rights for the City of Portland. So we are the Portland Anti-Racism team. There is our website. And you will find more information about us on our website. The mission of Take Part is to confront racism and to engage in dismantling the systems that perpetuate ingrained racial inequality. We do this through events, education, and outreach that foster engagement in building community where all people are treated with equality and respect. The views, thoughts, and opinions in the presentations at Take Part events do not necessarily represent those of Take Part and do not constitute an endorsement. All right, a little bit of technical information. Attendees are going to remain muted until the question and answer period. Dr. Smith has requested that questions be held until she's ready to take them. So she's going to go through her presentation first, and then she's going to invite questions. If a question comes up for you during the presentation and you're muted, you can use the chat box. So you'll find that chat box. I usually find it toward the bottom of my screen. So if you go to the chat button and push that, it'll pop up this little box. We have event team members who are going to be monitoring that chat box and pulling the great questions to present to Dr. Smith. So if something's on your mind during the presentation, feel free to go ahead and put it into the chat box. Otherwise, you can wait until the formal presentation is over, and then you can ask your question. Let's see. Yes. Also, if you'd like to ask your question live, then if you go to the participants button at the bottom of your screen, there is a raise hand feature. And what that will do is it will let the event hosts see a list of attendees who have their hands raised, and then they will call on you to ask your question. And of course, and we will unmute you when you're called on, but you will also have to then unmute yourself. So please be prepared to unmute yourself if you are called on. And then, of course, please keep your comments and questions concise and respectful. We have some community agreements that we like to go over before every one of our events. This is adopted from Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategy and also our team consultation. The first is to listen from the inside out or from the bottom up. So when you're listening, sometimes if we hear something challenging, it'll just kind of bounce off and we'll react. So you do want to use your skills of deeper listening when you're participating in these events. Engage tension, but do not indulge drama. So you might feel uncomfortable, you might feel some tension around ideas that are being discussed, and it's fine to just sit with it and be with it. It's fine to be uncomfortable. But we don't want to indulge drama, right? We're not just getting dramatic and, making a scene. 3, wait. Why am I talking? Am I talking just because I like to hear myself talk? Personally, I love to hear myself talk. So that's a reminder that I always need. Consultation and collaboration, not competition. So we're trying to collaborate and consult on meaningful ideas. So we're not competing with one another. Make space and take space. So some of us can dominate discussions, and that can leave some people out. So if you're somebody who's always talking, particularly if you're the member of a group that experiences some privilege, maybe you can take a step back and let some folks who often don't get their voices heard to come forward and have their voices heard. Likewise, please take your space. Please take that opportunity to share your perspective and share your voice with us. Confidentiality, take away the lessons, but leave the details. So we don't need to be sharing little tidbits that we hear about everybody in these events, but take away the lessons, please. Be open to learning. Again, you might hear some things that are kind of uncomfortable to hear, but just be open to learning. Just stay flexible and adaptable. Assume best intent, but attend to impact. When people say things, and this is particularly when we have our community discussions, Sometimes things land poorly, and you know, you might get your feelings hurt. You want to assume that people have the best intention, but likewise, if you're somebody who caused some hurt feelings, you need to attend to that impact, whether you had the intention of hurting somebody's feelings or not. So assume the best intent of people, but attend to the impacts that you cause. Finally, self-care and community care. If you're feeling triggered, if you're feeling upset, it's okay to step away and take a break and take care of yourself in that way. All right, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Smith. We are so excited to have you here this evening, Dr. Smith. Dr. Markisha Smith previously served as Director for the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the Oregon Department of Education. In that role, she provided leadership, guidance, professional learning, and support to school districts, various education partners, and community-based organizations on education equity throughout the state. Dr. Smith's work is specifically focused on best practice in equity, diversity, and inclusion, culturally responsive practice, and closing opportunity, access, and belief gaps for historically and currently marginalized groups across the state. Dr. Smith's previous experience includes working as the Director of Undergraduate Teacher Education at Warner Pacific College, as an assistant professor at Western Oregon University and Northern Michigan University, and as a high school English teacher in Houston, Texas for 9 years. She's a proud mother of 2 beautiful children, Cadence and Bryson. The mission of the Office of Equity and Human Rights is to provide education and technical support to city staff and elected officials, leading to recognition and removal of systemic barriers to fair and just distribution of resources, access, and opportunity, starting with issues of race and disability. In an interview with the Scanner newspaper, Dr. Smith has indicated that, quote, there is an urgency to sustain equity work as an asset through equitable outcomes, high expectations, meaningful engagement and consultation, and through honoring the rich and diverse experiences that have influenced the Bureau's creation and development over the past 7 years. It is imperative that organizations examine systems of oppression in order to interrupt their power and influence on marginalized communities. I am going to turn it over to Dr. Smith. I will be muted and hidden, and I will see you guys when we're ready for the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, good evening to everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. We did a little sound test. I will apologize. I have a parakeet and I have closed the door, but she is just full of joy this evening as I'm trying to talk. So I apologize for that in advance. I am just energized and excited to talk to you all anytime I have the opportunity to be in these spaces and to really share what I've been learning and growing into. It just really reminds me of how important what I'm doing is. And I often tell folks when they read my bio, one of the things that, you know, I've done all that wonderful stuff and, you know, I've got this position and that's all great. But really for me, the thing that I always want people to remember is that I'm a mother and that I'm a mother to Cadence and Bryson, and they center me, right? And so that is something that I remember anytime that I'm talking, anytime that I am sharing, is that, you know, what that means and what they mean for me as they empower me in spaces to do this work every day, even though they're driving me crazy in these quarantine-like circumstances. Some of you are laughing, you can relate. Okay, so I'm gonna jump right in, and I've got some slides that I'm going to be walking us through, and hopefully everything behaves, and it looks like it's behaving, so we're off to a good start. If anyone can't see something, please let someone know in the chat, and they will attend to you. But here we are. So when I was asked to talk, I had to really think very carefully about, you know, what I would be sharing. And I've had the opportunity over the last couple of months to really be more in the public eye. And I never imagined that the work that I was doing, the work that for me is both personal and professional, would actually find itself in such a public space. And I knew taking the role at the City of Portland would be different than any role that I'd had before in terms of my interface in a public way. but never did I imagine, and I'm sure most of us did not, that we would be in the middle of what I would say really are two pandemics, right? And a person on my staff said it best, right? That racism and anti-Blackness is a pandemic in the same ways that we are experiencing this health pandemic. And we're seeing the ways in which those things intersect as we think about our systems. And so I decided just to kind of give a little bit of information around this idea around systemic oppression and white supremacy and how that shows up in government. And I'm speaking from that perspective because that's where I sit now, but I would really offer that this is the way that white supremacy shows up in all of our structures, right? All of our systems. And so I was just thinking about it from this perspective as I am deeply entrenched in policy and practice and procedure and really what all that means. And so that's where I'm leading from today. So that's the journey we're going on, and we'll see how it goes. All right. I think I'm having the same problem. There we go. All right, got it working. So I want to ground us really quickly. And you are familiar with this photograph of George Floyd, who lost his life recently at the hands of police brutality. And I just want to read an excerpt from what I shared in City Council maybe a week or so after all of this began to transpire, and just to kind of ground us a little bit in what we're talking about. I can't breathe. I keep experiencing this phrase, the mental, emotional, psychological manifestation of what is normally a physical reaction to choking, loss of breath, struggling to fill one's lungs with air so that the exercise of inhaling and exhaling comfortably continues. I experience this phrase as a cry for help, a Black man or woman's last words, a plea to be released from the pressure, to no avail. Black folks in this country are suffocating, literally, as many have taken their last breath at the hands of police brutality, and metaphorically as a community who is struggling under the weight of racism. The events that have transpired over the last few days and nights highlight the reality that the COVID-19 pandemic has not erased the reality that racism still exists. White supremacy and white supremacists are not following a stay-at-home order. Racism hasn't been quarantined. We don't have drive-through locations to test for racism. It simply shows up in overt and covert ways. And while we anxiously await a vaccination to protect against the coronavirus, we're not looking for a vaccination for racism, because that would mean removing power and privilege, acknowledging the hate that people carry in the very fabric of their souls for Black folks. So I just wanted to sort of ground in that and give you a sense of just, where I've been, right? Personally, I think professionally as this work is happening. And let's just take 10 seconds to honor the lives of Black and brown folks, trans Black and brown folks that have been lost in our country recently. So if we could just take 10 minutes and do that, please, or 10 seconds, please. Okay, thank you for indulging that. So my goals for this evening are pretty simple. I want to explore how white supremacy really impacts our government structures. In fact, our government structures, our systems are built on white supremacy, and to think about really what that means, and simultaneously think about how we can disrupt systems of oppression, systemic oppression, and create systems that are equitable and just. What are the conversations that we need to be having? What are the ways in which we need to be changing our behaviors in our personal and professional spaces? And then finally, really making a commitment to centering the voices and experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, because often we think that we're centering them by inviting someone to the table, but they've neither made the table, have no idea what's on the menu. Sometimes they're on the menu, right? And so we have this, I think, false perception about what it means to really center the voice of a community that is navigating systems that were never designed for them to begin with. And so what does it mean to really center, right? And obviously to center means that some other things have to be decentered, right? We have to sort of peel that back. So hopefully this is where we can get to today. So I want to just start really quickly, but by centering us also in what we mean by culture, as we're going to be talking about white supremacy culture. And so culture really is those beliefs, those values, those attitudes, roles, right? Concepts of the universe, material objects, possessions, all of which is acquired by a group of people. And, you know, in some sort of way in which they navigate the world, generation after generation through individual and group striving. We can think about culture as communication. We can think about culture again as a way of life of a group of people, right? That often it just sort of happens, right? We generally do these things or act in these ways without thinking about them. And there's this unspoken sort of communication that is inherent in the way that we understand culture and the way that we navigate culture. And again, that sort of passed from generation to generation. And we can also think about culture as a collective programming of the mind that really distinguishes the member of one group or category of people from another, right? And so I think that last point is really important as we're thinking about what white supremacy culture does for us, right? Sort of this programming that happens, this programming of beliefs and values and ideas that are inherently not designed with Black, Indigenous, and people of color in mind, right? We're not designed, that was not the foundation for which they were shaped. And so understanding how not only white folks in a culture, right, begin to sort of adapt these white supremacy values, norms, and beliefs, but also people of color, right? And what does that mean? And we're not talking about that here today, but I want us to keep in mind that we've all ingested some parts and pieces of white supremacy culture. And we have to really acknowledge and sort of think about what that means for us as we navigate our spaces. So that's sort of a grounding in culture. I don't know if folks are familiar with this graphic. I'd seen it some time ago and then it's resurfaced here recently in social media as a way to really think about, and I said in my speech during city council, that piece around how racism sort of shows up in overt and covert ways. But, this is what happens, right? So things that are very overt, those are the things we often find ourselves focusing on, things that we see, right? Swastikas and KKK. We have this very sometimes limited view of what white supremacy is, of what racism looks like, right? And we don't often realize that we are swimming in a system that is socially accepting of some other ways in which white supremacy shows up. And so we talk about the color blindness. We talk about the calling the police on Black people. There's, the barbecue Beckys and all the things that have been sort of happening in social media about that. We think about, blaming the victim. We think about the fact that, well, we have Black friends, or you don't sound Black, or this whole idea about things that are English only, or anti-immigration policies. What happens in schools, sort of this denial. I've been told you're so articulate, right? So all of that is socially acceptable, right? White supremacy. But if you really think about this, you remove that line, all of this, right? And we've participated, right, in some way, shape, or form. All of this really is the system that we are swimming in, right? And so to say what is acceptable and what's not, it's all unacceptable, right? And so how do we begin to sort of think about what's below that line and how that is impacting what we do on a daily basis? And so this, not so much, connected to, anything in particular, but this is just, again, kind of the water that we swim in, right? And we have to think about how we're showing up, right? And how we're either doing our work or not to understand the impacts. So just kind of letting that sit there. And like I said, this has reemerged in my feeds recently, and I really have had to sit with it and think about what some of this means in ways in which I've seen this happen, in ways in which maybe even myself, having been a participant, right? What does that look like? So I'm going to spend some time, and this is where we're going to get into a little bit of what happens at the governmental level, talking about how white supremacy works. And this is from the work of Tima Okun. And if you're familiar with that work around white supremacy culture, this is really a collection of different works that kind of come together to list out these particular characteristics. And this list of characteristics show up in our organizations. And here, I'm thinking in terms of our government organizations. And culture is powerful precisely because it is so present, and at the same time, so very difficult to name and identify. Again, kind of going back to that slide around culture. We just sort of do this, right? This is just the way in which we behave, and we don't think about it, right? We don't stop and sort of think about what that impact might be. And so these characteristics are often damaging. They are damaging because they are used as the standard for the way that we do business. And if as I kind of go through, and if you're not familiar with this, welcome. If you are, this is a good little refresher. But I think what was really, for me, I just had to sort of sit and reflect with that, is how I've had to sort of push back on some of this. And at the same time, in order to be in the positions that I've had the fortune to be in, or to, be at the tables where I've had the fortune to be at, that I've actually had to adapt and adjust to some of this in order to navigate those spaces. And so thinking about what happens to Black, Indigenous, and people of color in professional spaces, I'll be even more specific, as I've said here, in government spaces, that forces them to adapt this culture, this white supremacist culture, so that they can continue to move forward in their career. They can advance in certain ways, or that they can be educated, all of that, right? So that they can make a living for their family. The ways in which you have to sacrifice your own culture and your own self in order to make it in our white supremacist culture, right? So just sort of thinking about that. So we're going to explore each of these separately, and I won't spend a lot of time here. I've got just a few bullet points per slide, but if there are additional questions, as we said, we'll have some time at the end and I can take those. So we're going to look at perfectionism first. And this whole idea around perfectionism and how that shows up in white supremacist culture and in our professional culture is that really any mistakes are seen as something wrong with you, right? If there's a mistake made in some sort of work. And so often in a government context, if there's a policy or a program that didn't make it past city council or didn't quite get to where it needed to be, that's about the person. And if it's a person of color, oh boy, right? So that becomes more about the person. And we often try to focus on what's wrong instead of thinking about and celebrating what's right. And so we don't really take time to think about a process because we're so worried about making sure that things are perfect. There's little appreciation for the ways in which people express their work and their creativity, because if it's anything outside of the scope of that perfection, of that standard, then it's not okay. And so sort of thinking about how do we fix that, right? How do we correct that? We can begin to think about how we have cultures of appreciation. We can be an organization or a government or a structure that is willing to learn and let that be okay. And finally, we can talk about what's going well. As an educator, I always was taught, don't come into a parent and first tell them all the things that may not be going right in that classroom setting between you and that student, but try and praise the things that are. And so this culture of white supremacy tells us that perfectionism is what we're striving for, right? And so how do we dismantle that, right? The second is around this sense of urgency. Oh my goodness. I remember working at the Department of Education for almost 6 years. I was there, and every time there was a legislative session, right? We had a long session, short session, it didn't matter, right? An in-between session. There was always this mantra of not having enough time. There was no time, and we had to do things right now or they weren't going to get done. And the pressure that puts on individuals within an organization to act, what we often would find when we were sort of sitting down long enough to really reflect was that we were sacrificing true engagement. We were sacrificing making sure that the communities that we said we wanted to center were actually being centered. Like we weren't doing that. And so in this culture of white supremacy, that sense of urgency just tells us we need to see results and we need to see numbers. And we don't have time to slow down and think about really what it is that we're doing. And so a way to fix that is thinking about what's realistic in a work plan. I've been asking folks at the city, let's slow down. We have all this CARES Act funding that's coming out to provide some relief and recovery for COVID. And I've asked folks, slow down, let's think about this. And it took us a month and a half, a couple months to really make sure, yeah, we're getting stuff out the door, we're getting money out the door, but we're doing it with some intentionality and we're doing it with an equity framework. And so that also means that leadership has to be willing to slow down. And as I said, are we taking time to reflect on how this past sense of urgency may not have gotten us the results that we really wanted or really thought were what we were looking for, right? So we've got to slow down, right? But we live in a culture of white supremacy that says everything is urgent. We never have time. Then we talk about defensiveness. And this comes up a lot of times when we're calling folks out about things. And I, as a woman of color, as a Black woman, being in spaces largely in government structures that are white male dominated, it has taken me a long time to figure out like what is really the proper way or the appropriate way to really approach someone about an issue that may be about them, may be about the work, doesn't matter, but in a way that they don't get defensive, right? And so it's about trying to protect power and about protecting feelings, and it's not about doing the work. And so we got to get out of the way. Like white supremacy has us thinking that, it's a power grab. And if you say something, that's about me. I'm taking that personal. And so rather than thinking about what's the link between defensiveness and fears, people don't want to talk about racism. I don't know if I think that, that is generally true. People don't want to talk about things that are ugly, that, really are the soil and the fabric of the creation of this country. People don't want to talk about that. And they also don't want to talk about, so if you think they don't want to talk about that, they don't want to talk about how that soil and how that foundation has got us where we are today. And so when you start bringing that up and you start talking about, hey, we've got some stuff that, that's not sitting right? There's defensiveness, and that defensiveness and that fear go hand in hand. And we've got to name it as a problem. We've got to give people credit. That's the other part. I don't know how many times I've put together a program or something, and there was no credit given to me. And it wasn't about having my name in lights, didn't need to be on Broadway. But in that power grab, we often forget, right? We forget who is the originator of something. We think about many of our inventions in this country. Our country founded on the labor and the backs of Black folks, right? And we don't give that credit, right? And so that's something else to think about, right? Stopping the defensiveness. And then this whole idea around quantity over quality. I don't know if you are in spaces where more sometimes, and we've got another one here that more is sometimes somehow better. And so in white supremacist culture and in these government structures, we got to produce, right? And we focus on measurements. So I've been having conversations with people about performance measures and how we're going to measure that we say we're doing equity, but we're not really taking the time to value the process, right? So what is the process that we need to be thinking about? And so how can we have a value statement, right? That's a part of what we do. How do we get off of our agendas, right? How do we put our agenda aside and think about what the bigger agenda is, what the bigger issue is, and really have some goals that honor process and not just product, okay? So quantity over quality, right? And how do we reconcile for that in a culture that says that we've got to produce, produce. And here we're talking about the worship of the written word. And so I kind of chuckled when I thought about this. I don't know if those of you who have kids or have seen the movie Boss Baby. I remember at some point there was a scene in the movie where he's like, we got to get a memo, right? Or write a memo, right? And so he's sort of, the baby is talking to his assistant, right? And, trying to dictate what this memo would be. But in white supremacist culture, if there isn't a memo, if there isn't something written, then it doesn't exist. And so we don't have this value for the other ways in which information is communicated. And here's the thing, Black, Indigenous, people of color cultures, things don't often are not written down, right? There is the oral tradition. There is the importance of sitting down and having a conversation with someone, having a connection with someone that is way more valuable than something that's in black and white on a piece of paper, right? And so here, one of the fixes that we can think about is how do we recognize the skills that everyone brings? I see that happen in our government structures. We don't value people that can't write reports. We don't value people that can't present before council without, a script, right? That's sort of looked on as like, what are they doing, right? So we need to think about how we're actually valuing the skills that everyone brings and determine what needs to be written and what doesn't, right? Because not everything needs to be written down in order for it to be valuable, right? So worship of the written word. Here, talking about only one right way, right? And so here we talk about the fact that in government structures and organizations that individuals have to learn what the right way is, and you just adapt to it. So there are procurement processes. They don't make any sense, right? They don't make any sense to anybody that's handling any money. But this is the way that we've been doing business. And if you don't get that right, you're penalized for that, right? So there's something wrong with you, or you're not doing your job well enough. And so, there's some sort of penalty that's attached to that. And so one of the fixes, or some of the fixes to think about, is that we have to think about acceptance of a variety of ways in which to achieve a goal. We've been doing things, right, in government structures for forever, right, just for the sake of doing them. But how do we interrupt that and think about doing them in a way that better centers the communities and the voices that we say we want to center? And so we have to notice also folks that bring something new to the table. And I think that's really powerful because often that's not valued, right? Those are the troublemakers within an organization or within a government structure, rather than being seen as creative and really thinking about how community brings a different way of knowing, doing, and being. And I thought this was really funny. So thinking about paternalism, and here, what often happens is we have decision-making that's only clear to the people that are in power, and they're really not interested or thinking about who doesn't get it, right? That's okay, because they're not in power. They don't have to be privy to whatever this decision is. And they don't think it's necessary to actually engage viewpoints from those for whom they're making decisions, right? I can think about an example, many examples that are happening right now at the federal level. Not thinking about the folks that are being impacted by the decisions that we're making. So we're just going to do this because we know what's best for you. And so we have to think about how do we instead have systems that have transparency about decision making, that have transparency about whose authority and whose responsibility is what, and that BIPOC here, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities are centered and authentically included. And that does not just mean we invite you and we can check that off, right? We've got, a box that we're checking. That's not what we're talking about here, right? So how do we actually make sure that there is a clear mechanism for knowing what's happening, okay? Either or thinking, kind of talked about this. Some of these overlap, you will notice. Good, bad, right, wrong, with us, against us. There's no sense of a both and. Can't be, right? So that's kind of linked to perfectionism. Either this way or there is no other way. And so how do we push to create alternatives? How do we slow down and analyze the things that we're doing? I was in a meeting not too long ago and thinking about how we were going to distribute some funding. And one of the folks on the call just could not get past the part that we needed to do this differently. And the way that we were proposing to do it just was the wrong way. That actually was the language that was used. Well, that's just the wrong way. That's not the way that we do this procurement process. That doesn't make any sense. And I was like, well, really? Right? So if we are saying that we are valuing the communities and centering the communities that need this funding the most, then we have to think about a different structure or a different way of making sure that we get it to them. And there was a lot of back and forth about that. Or, we'll have these mounds and mounds of paperwork and reports that we're requiring organizations to complete in order to get funding or to stay eligible for funding, and not thinking about how we build capacity and how we're educating folks to be able to sort of navigate these systems. But at the same time, how are we disrupting that so that we're making pathways that are clear and that are not cumbersome and that are not so overwhelming that folks don't even want to be engaged, right? So getting out of that either or thinking. And then here, power hoarding, that kind of goes back again. Some of these are linked to one another, right? So no value in sharing power. It's sort of like you create something, you go in your little bubble and you keep it. Those with power assume that they know what's best for everybody. So making decisions, right, for everyone. We got to think about what good leadership looks like. So that's on the flip side, right? What does good leadership look like, sound like? How is that connected to our mission and our values? How are we making sure that we develop power and skills in others as we are doing our work and navigating our work? So got to let the power hoarding go. There's a fear of open conflict. And here, we don't have time to really explore it, but this whole thing has been this whole phenomenon around white tears and this fear of or blatant ignoring of or condescending behavior towards emotion or any expressed conflict. And so we have to emphasize on being polite. White supremacist culture says we have to be polite and we can't hurt anybody's feelings. And that if you call somebody out about something, that it's on you, right? That you're the one. And we don't think about how sometimes that fear or that ignoring or those white tears really detract or are a detour from the issue at hand, right? We're trying to eradicate some stuff. And so we've got to stop now and take a moment and comfort that individual or individuals. And then it just sort of, all the attention goes away from the other really tremendous impact, right? That's happening within the work or within other individuals in a space. And I see this happen often in government structures. I witnessed it happen at city council a few months back when I first started, really just this, this testimony that happened, and there was just this exchange that was really yucky. And there was a focus on the individual that had come to the table and was crying, but not a focus on the woman of color in the space that was being tremendously harmed by what was happening with her colleagues and also this person giving testimony, right? So we weren't focused there, focus our attention somewhere else. And so a way to fix that, we can't prescribe a way for issues to be raised. You can't tell me how to show up in a space when there is emotion attached to racism. I experience this every day. So telling me to be polite about that, that's not getting us anywhere. We've been polite for too long. Can't be polite about it anymore. That doesn't mean I'm trying to intentionally hurt folks, but it does mean that we have to be able to hear some things that make us uncomfortable. We have to be able to hear some things that may, make us squirm a little bit or make us question ourselves a little bit. And I can't be judged for that, right? It's unfair for me to be judged for that. And then we have to take the opportunity when a conflict has been resolved to really revisit it and think about what do we learn from that. Again, individualism, this has come up in some of our other themes here. So in white supremacist culture, this no value for collective, right? Communities of color, Black folks are collectivist cultures by nature, right? And so working together, working with a team, I call my team a family, right? Just as an example. And they're not my blood family, blood relatives, but they're a family. We are a collective. And so white supremacist culture will tell us that we have to solve problems alone and that there has to be individual credit given, and we can't really value teamwork, right? We can't really give credit where credit is due, or use a team structure to create and innovate and to really think outside the box. And so those are ways that we can fix it, right? Teamwork is valued. We can't do this work of dismantling systems of oppression in an individualistic mindset. We can't do that with a white supremacy value of individualism. It will not work. You all in this collective right here this evening are a testament to how that can't work, right? We have to be a collective to do this. Got just a couple more. I'm the only one, kind of goes back to that connection to individualism. And I often say this as a parent, I'll be honest. If I want something done right, you do it yourself. Some of you have said that as well. But I think the connotation here is different, obviously, in our professional context. And so how can we begin to think about a shared responsibility model? How can we begin to delegate tasks? I think in a government structure that is already so siloed that we often don't think about how can we do some work across bureaus, right? How can we engage conversations that we haven't had before? And we've gotten so accustomed to functioning in a white supremacist culture that says that, we're the only one, right? Or we're the only organization, or we're the only, right? And we're not really thinking about what that looks like in a shared model. Progress is bigger, or progress is more. This is really cute, like all these puppies. Some of you may be like, oh, I could handle that. Maybe you can, I don't know. I'm gonna speak for myself and say absolutely not. But in white supremacist culture, there often is this success equaling bigger or more, or success equaling expansion. So if we just have more programs or more teams or more XYZ, then that shows that we are successful, or that shows that we've made it. And we don't really think about how just building something without intentionality can affect our past, present, and future, right? We don't really think about how we include progress goals in the way that we're planning. We're just trying to make sure that we got a lot. And this is also sometimes a detour, because if we can say that we've got a lot of programs that are serving communities of color, and we can sort of check that box, right? Well, we're doing this, or we've got an education program there, we've got a food program that's happening there. It's just more, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's better. And it also doesn't necessarily mean that it's centered in what the community says that they need, and what is most valuable to them. And so that's another thing to really think about here. Objectivity. So a lot of folks just want to remain neutral right now, and neutrality is not an option in the time that we're living in right now. It is just not, right? And so, again, kind of talking about the emotional piece, be in spaces where being emotional is seen as irrational or destructive, right? And that we have to think in a linear fashion. And I'll just remain neutral. Like I don't have an opinion on that. You better have an opinion about some stuff today, right? People are dying in the streets. They've been dying in the streets, but now we're seeing it play out right in real time. And you better just not be neutral. Like that's not the position that folks need to be taking right now. So we've got to think about vast perspectives and views, and we got to be able to sit with that discomfort, as we talked about before. When people are expressing their ways of being, knowing, and doing that aren't familiar to you, that are different than yours are. Quickly, right to comfort. So those in power have the right to emotional and psychological comfort, kind of going back to the tiers piece. And so a lot of times individual acts of unfairness, that's white people with systemic racism that daily impacts Black, Indigenous, and people of color, right? But it all of a sudden is taken personally. And we've got to comfort. So we got to be in the business of, causing some discomfort to really get to the root of learning and growing. You've got to deepen your political knowledge around white supremacy, racism, systemic oppression. Hopefully this is giving you an opportunity to engage in some of that in this space now, if you haven't before. All right, so those are just some of the thoughts that come from this work by Tuma Okun. And I think, like I said, that they are both ways in which I'm seeing white supremacy culture show up. And there are some ways that we can combat that if we try, right? If we really are about the business of doing this right. And I wanted to not leave without also saying a word about anti-Blackness. And so this is another important concept that's wrapped up in the work that we're doing right now, that talks about basically this is the fear, the devaluation or abuse of Black people. I found a couple other pieces to sort of pull this out. Anti-Black racism is specific exclusion and precedence against people who are visibly perceived to be of African descent, what we would call Black folks. And anti-Black racism is a toxic cocktail that mixes with these beliefs with how people with power make decisions, how government policies are made, or how state services are delivered. It happens all the time. And if you look at this graphic, this was shared in a workshop that I was in last fall. If you think about the roots of a tree, right, all that's going on underneath the surface, if you look at that, the foundation at the very, very bottom of this is anti-Blackness. And so if you think about the fact that we are in a soil, right, that we are sort of at the top, right, the everyday racism is sort of the leaves here. You've got, it's hard to see there, but it's the education system, our mass media, our criminal justice system are the things in there to the left in blue. Like all those are sort of the branches, right? White supremacy, you see where it sits, right? Kind of at the base, but at the root, at the very, very bottom of all of this is this piece around anti-Blackness. And anti-Blackness is not just specific to white folks, right? Anti-Blackness is something that permeates our entire culture, right? And how that shows up for other people of color when they think about Black folks, right? So anti-Blackness, I just didn't want to not put this here for folks to really understand that at the core, we're talking about white supremacy, right? But at the very bottom of that, in the very depths of the soil, is this reality around anti-Blackness and what that means and how that shows up. So very quickly, we talked about, what we do center and what we need to stop centering. And here, how can we decenter whiteness? And these are just some tips. This is not it, right? So when you think about how you're going to commit to making sure that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are centered in the work that you're doing, these are just some things to think about. Stop being the first person to talk in every space. Sometimes you just need to listen, and you need to listen even when you're uncomfortable, and then listen again, right? And I think that's really important. And this doesn't mean that you stop doing your work. So I need for folks to understand there's still work, and I've said this to my white colleagues. There's work that white folks need to do. They need to do their work, and that cannot be the responsibility of other people of color to do for you. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't be engaged with and community with, that you can't ask questions of, but they can't do that work. We can't carry that emotional baggage and also try and figure out how to navigate these systems that weren't designed for us. So I want to put that little plug in there as well. But being willing to listen. You got to be supportive or be of use to projects that are established and at their very core are led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And not that you have to be the one in charge, right? That's kind of going back to our talk around how white supremacist culture shows up, right? So how can you be of use or be in support of? And then a few other things here. Don't think of yourself as doing good or giving back, right? And here I wouldn't even say so much reparations, because that sort of gets into a financial piece. But this is serious, right? So just don't rest in that. Don't rest in just getting a pass, right? Because you did one good deed one day. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to dismantle our systems. Make sure that you're advocates for social justice in your hiring practices. If you're in places where, and I've been really working on this at the government level, at the higher leadership structure, where the majority of the people in power are white males, I'm really trying to disrupt that and think about what does a pathway for leadership look like for individuals who are in positions now that want to move up. And we don't right now have a really good system for mentoring and shaping what that looks like for our Black employees. And then, here, challenging racial profiling and police brutality in your neighborhood. And we've been seeing that happen in protests and other organized events. But again, to remain silent or to remain neutral is not an option. And so these are just some ways in which we can decenter whiteness and begin to center our Black, Indigenous, people of color in the conversations that are so vital to our really to our longevity as a society. We've come to the point now where what we've been doing doesn't work. We can't go back to normal. Everybody's like, I want to go back to normal. No, you don't, right? Because normal wasn't getting us where we needed to be. And people of color have known that and have experienced that since the very beginning of their time in this country. Few resources, I won't spend time there. I'll stop and say thank you and shut my mouth. So here we go. Thank you so much. That was a whirlwind. I was talking fast.
That was awesome, Dr. Smith. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to move into the question and answer period. So remember, you can use the chat box. You can also use the raise hands function, and we will try to get as many questions as we can. I do have some that I took down from the chat box for you first. So Julio has a question. How do you balance the need for fiscal responsibility with public funds versus the need for communities to have access to funding and grants?
Yeah. So I think thank you for the question, Julio. We're trying to flip it. And this has been, I think, really evident in our conversations about CARES Act funding. So we got $114 million from the federal government to use for COVID relief and response. And instead of just sort of thinking about it in the normal way, right? The way that we always do business, is that we're going to give it to these organizations that we know do this work. We're going to make sure we sprinkle in a little bit of this and a little bit of that to make it look like. No, we started with who are the communities that we have not been serving? Who are the communities that we don't even engage in our city government processes? We started there. And I'm so thankful that I was working with a group of fellow bureau directors that were willing to have that conversation. We started there and then worked our way back, right? So we know that, yeah, there'll be some reporting things and some other things that have to go into this, but let's start first by really acknowledging, one, the harm, right, that government has done to these communities, and two, how can we now, with this opportunity, it's not a lot of money, right? It went really fast. They started dividing that up and I got scared. I'm like, where is it going? But how can we use this moment in time to really do things the way that we haven't done before? And I think that I've seen that play out, and I've seen it happen where we don't have to start with what we can't do, right? Or what some rule in some book very arbitrarily written tells us we can't do. We need to start with what we can do, what we will do, what we're committed to doing. So we start there, everything else will work out. Now, they may not like my perspective on it from a procurement standpoint. I've been giving them a hard time lately. But I think we just do things sometimes because we just have been doing them. And we don't really have a reason. And I often ask, well, why do we do it that way? And everybody just kind of stops and thinks, we don't really know why. So flipping that would be my response. And I've seen it work. It's working.
Thank you. Personally, I was super impressed with how that grant money distribution was handled. I mean, frankly, I was floored. And I kept wondering, I'm like, who is doing this? And now I know it was you.
Not me alone. I won't take the We had some resources. We had put together a COVID response and relief equity toolkit. We were really centering. And surprisingly, and this was a good feeling, I didn't have to remind people, right? Folks were actually saying, hey, wait a minute. We want to make sure, right, that Black communities get that first. And that was not, I was like, oh my, right? Like that was not a conversation that I've been a part of, right? So it was refreshing. And I just hope we continue that same trajectory moving forward.
Me too. Next question, and this is my question. What can the average Portlander do to encourage equity in our local governments?
I think you can, start thinking about who's in leadership. And a lot of times those voices, obviously they drive what happens. And so one of the things that I think has been really, really important is, who's representing you, right, in these spaces in government. And if that's not representative, right, if those voices aren't representative, how are we trying to, get behind, rally behind, have a collective sort of pathway to change that? Because I remember the first time at state government when I went to a legislative session, very first time ever, and I was floored. And I said, oh, this is why Black children are not doing well in school. I looked, right? And folks have really good intentions, but just the conversations that were happening were not conversations that I knew were going to benefit my son or daughter, or the decisions that were being made, right, were not going to benefit folks in communities where I do my work and live and play. And so I think we have to think about who's in leadership. And we're seeing a lot of that change. I think definitely at the state level, and we're, Commissioner Hardesty, right? Like that's, first Black woman, I believe, to have a council seat. So that's, that's where I would focus some attention from a community perspective. Who's in leadership and what's the influence there?
Thank you. We have a question from Mary Ann. Portland Community College also has a silos problem in their organization. So how can large organizations address the silos issue so communication happens across the board?
I think first you have to acknowledge that silos exist. Not everybody thinks that's the case. I've been at a table like, we work with them all the time. And I was like, you don't work with us. I don't know what office you came to, but it wasn't mine. So I think that we have to really, acknowledge that silos do exist, number one. And then so thinking about like what the foundation of our organizations, what that's built on, like it's built for folks, like I've just shared, right, to sort of work in these individual kinds of ways. And so if we educate ourselves about that, then we can think about what the opposite of that looks like, right? So if we don't know, right, that this is the way that the structure is built and we just sort of operate in it, and we've got some folks that are going, I don't know, right? Like, PSU, like we need to be doing something different, acknowledging that, looking at the history and foundation behind that. And then just, it takes sometimes just a small group of folks that say, we're not going to, we need to do something different. And we need to, collectively come together and think about what that looks like. And so our directors, as an example right now, we are working on a pathway for what we collectively want equity to look like moving forward within our bureaus. And so even though my office is situated to kind of lead that conversation for the city, the directors really felt it was important that they all come together and also have a message around that. And that's very different, because they kind of, water does its thing and transportation does its thing, right? And so this is the first time we're creating a shared document that articulates the direction that we want to go. And that's exciting. That's just a small group of us, right, that's doing that. But that it will have a big effect on the larger organization. And we acknowledge that there are silos, right? That was kind of the first step.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. A question from Valerie. Can you say a little more about how we can balance an effort to decenter white voices and amplify the voices of our Black and Indigenous people of color colleagues, while not asking or expecting them to do more work, quote, helping white people understand?
Mm-hmm. So that piece kind of goes back to listen. And I think with that, this is also the time to step back a little. And I've implored my colleagues to do the same. Black folks are carrying a lot of weight right now, have been. And so there needs to be some space and some time for grieving, the sort of collective grieving that's happening, that we're seeing play out. And I think that if there is an intentional effort, right, a very purposeful effort for leadership within an organization to say, like, if there's a commitment that says, we're going to center our Black, Indigenous, and people of color voices, that you'll begin to see sort of an emergence, right, of those folks in a different way. And there has to be a lot of patience with that. I think that, we can't rush that. Folks are in pain. Folks are tired of doing the work. I'm tired every other day. But, how do we got to sit back, kind of be doing our work, right? So white folks doing the work, sit back, make a commitment that is not just on something on paper, but that is something in deed, something that you're doing, that you're changing. And that's where you begin to see sort of, okay, now voices are emerging in a different way that are leading the conversation. I think as an example, we have Juneteenth is now a paid holiday for folks in the city of Portland. And I know that it was really important at that resolution, the passing of that resolution, that city council, our mayor, just needed to listen. Like, he needed to hear the pain of experience from Black employees at the city of Portland. And that's what he got to hear that day. And it had a tremendous impact. And I think the saying that we're going to honor this and we're going to do this differently, I think it's folks are sort of struggling with, was it just a performative sort of thing? Do we really mean this? And so I think we just, we have to continue to think about sitting back, giving some space, giving some time, white folks doing their work, and making some systemic changes that Black, Indigenous, and people of color can see, that there's a different way of doing business, and that they don't have to do it, right? They don't have to carry it by themselves. So.
Thank you. So Julio wants to ask you a question. Julio, I'm going to unmute you. And you can go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for your generosity with time. Um, so for people that has done work around anti-blackness, working with government agencies, and trying to address racism within the structures of government agency, I feel that we're at a point in which what we have done in the past doesn't cut it anymore. We can't keep showing the same PBS documentaries, talking about incremental change, talking about making it better, because when we do that under the present circumstances, we fall short. Not only we fall short, but we dishearten people of color that are working in government. But what we really need to be doing, we can't really do, because what we need to be doing is ripping apart the fabric of government bureaucracy, because it's rooted on white supremacy. How do we go to the people in the decision-making positions within our different government institutions, and we tell them none of this light stuff we have been done before, and that we had to fight with you to get through, and that you approve because it still makes you feel good about yourself. Now we have to move to
Uh-oh, I'm
the
losing
next stage.
Julio's question.
And then what is that next are going to make us think this differently?
I lost a little bit of what you said at the end, Julio. I know if other people, it
So
kind
the last bit that I said was, and if we're ready to move to this direction, where is the
of,
document? Where is the information?
oh, Julio, I'm so sorry.
We lost you there, Julio. I'm sorry, but we heard you for quite a bit of it. Dr. Smith, do you have something you want to
All
address?
right.
I think just a part of what I was hearing in Julio's commentary was this piece, and I've been thinking about, like, because city council, right, is sort of our, that's the top of our leadership structure. And so I've been thinking about and having some conversations with folks about how do we really, because I think, fundamentally they understand, right, this moment of time that we're in. But, what's the education that needs to go on at that level? Because I think people are in varying places, right? That's just in full transparency. And I think we see that play out when council decisions are made, right? Or when they're having conversations about things, you sort of see where people sit. And so I've really been about thinking about how do we educate folks at that level, to hear something like what I'm sharing with you today, right? Like, I don't know if they have or if they haven't, but I think that's really important because, then they can think about how does this influence, what I'm deciding makes sense, or, this policy that we say we're going to fund, or this program that we're going to, this initiative that we're going to put money into, like, what does that look like? And so I think really, that education at the leadership level has been vital. And I'm just sort of thinking about, like, I know it's happening for our directors. We're having some conversation, but I really wonder about what that looks like at a city council level. So I don't know if that gets at everything that Julio was saying. I'm so sorry we couldn't capture everything that you were saying, but there was applause, and I was like, yes. So it was good, Julio.
Thank you very much. Next question from David. He says, I'm integrating your talk with some reading I've done by Ibram Kendi when he talks about the roots of racism being found in the desire for profit, and thus solving racism needs to include making racism economically disadvantageous. How do we, through government structures and schools, use interest convergence to make eliminating racism a priority for more white people, not just the liberal ones?
So that's going to mean some people have to be uncomfortable with the fact that they your power and privilege, right? Because if we change something, so if we no longer say that we're going to have systems that criminalize kids in school, or systems that do not, that have disparate outcomes, health outcomes for Black, Indigenous, people of color. Like we're gonna say, so that's gonna mean that something about those services will change for you. And that's uncomfortable, right? Because we're not doing things the same way that we were before. And so I always say there's no other way but to do it, but that takes like, so you're right, your few folks that are like all on board, but when you actually, and I've said this, like we're making this commitment, we're saying all these things, we're holding ourselves accountable, but when it really gets down to it, and there's something that's gonna make you uncomfortable, are you gonna be really willing to stay the course? And so if we're no longer funding things that are systemically oppressive, right? If we just stop doing those things, and we fund other things that are equitable and just, you know, that's a model, right? We just won't do this and we're going to do that. But that also is recognizing that there are going to be some people that are uncomfortable by those decisions. But then I say, you know, slavery wasn't comfortable. Racism is not comfortable. These things are not comfortable. And so it's time for some folks to get, to experience some discomfort so that we can move where we need to move. And, you know, it's just that simple. I don't know, you just got to rip the Band-Aid off. Like, I don't know what else we can do. And acknowledging there's going to be some people that are going to push back, because that's going to, you know, that's about the power piece, right? That's the power hoarding. I don't want to lose something that's fundamentally attached to who I am and the way in which I navigate the world. And I shrug my shoulders and say, we can't do what we're doing because it's not working, right? Yeah.
Thank you. A question from Lindsay. Other than voting, what can we do about police brutality?
I think continuing to have, you know, when there are conversations happening about police reform, staying in tune with that, you know, particularly our city level, you know, that there's kind of a 17-point plan that the mayor released last month around police reform, and sort of, we're not saying defund the police because they still have funding, right? That's a bigger conversation. But I think being present when there's opportunities for public testimony about that is really important. There's going to be some conversation at some time here coming up about, so some of the money from that police reform has been reallocated, but there's a pot of money that has not. And so at some point here soon, we're going to start having conversations about what that looks like. And so I think, what are the programs that are going to best serve our community so that we have a different model of what policing looks like. And I would also say that, you know, I've really been advocating for the fact that we do not have we have a structure, but it's not a really solid structure around how police officers are educated around issues of white supremacy and racism and all of the things. And there's some advocacy, I think, that can be done there. And so as much as you can speak up in public testimony in these spaces here locally and also at the state level, there's a lot going on with the People of Color Caucus as it relates to police reform. If you can be in those spaces, that's going to be the powerful move right now.
Thank you. Question from JC. How do we unravel local issues when both sides believe that their side supports racial equity? For example, issues like the residential infill project.
That's a hard question. We have to get some of the commissioners on here. I think, you know, I often say that it seems like, you know, everything seems to be going okay and everybody seems to be on the same page, and then there'll be one side conversation or one phone call or text that happens, and all of a sudden everything changes, right? Everything switches. And I think one of the I would say challenges in our government structure is that it is the way that it is, right? We have commissioners that have bureaus that, right, it's sort of this, it is not designed for a process that is collective. And I know that, you know, it's been on the table for many years and it's coming up again. around just, you know, our city council structure, but that's hard, right? Like they don't always play nice together. And when they do, how they define equity is very different. And I won't speak for them, but I know that that's a challenge, I think, both within the structure and, you know, folks have their own individual agendas as well.
Indeed, they do. Okay, do we have more questions for Dr. Smith? If I'm missing anybody who's got their hands raised, team, please let me know. Anybody?
I think I see a hand. No, that's a clap. Oh, okay. That's a clap. All right. I can't distinguish. This is a hand. This is a clap. Zoom etiquette. I should know that by now. Like I spend my life on here.
Yes. Here we have a question from Alicia. Are there organizations you would recommend we can get involved in to help change policy and structure?
I can give you a list of some things. And so if you will follow up, I will do that.
Okay.
Some of that's tied to some of the CARES Act work we've been doing.
Okay.
Some really awesome grassroots organizations that are doing some work in the community right now.
Great. And we are recording this event and it will be available, and we are going to get a resource list from Dr. Smith. So please don't worry about getting some of this stuff. We'll get it to you later. Just may take us a minute. Okay, any other questions? These are all great questions.
Good questions.
And Kevin, you and I had about the same questions, so I didn't specifically ask your take on it, but if you aren't satisfied with what you've heard so far, please ask it again. All right. Okay. Just lots of thank yous coming in, and we are so grateful, and this is so exciting. I'm just so glad you came tonight and shared with us. This was really incredible. And thank you for the work that you do at the City of Portland. Your department is so important to our city. And if we are going to create the city that everyone deserves, it's work that has to be prioritized. And I thank you so much for doing it. And I thank you for the time and the effort that you put into this presentation for us. We're so grateful.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate being here. This has been a wonderful conclusion to my work day. I just, couldn't be more excited to see your faces and the wonderful questions. This is a labor of love for me. And even though I say I'm tired, I will keep doing it, right? And kind of going back to Cadence and Bryson, right? My foundation and my reason really for doing the work that I do. There's many reasons, but they're like the primary, right? Right now, they sort of center me. So I'm just excited, to keep going. And I love the people that I work with. Yeah, someone asked, my kids are 10 and 4. So the 10-year-old was making coffee while we were talking. Coffee. And I threw a shoe at her, which you all didn't hear, which means I'm good.
Good. And
while I was talking.
Someone, we do have a hand raised, the person called iPhone. Please ask your question.
This is Marge. I worked in the school district for a long time, and I want to know what your ideas about changing curriculum for students toward equity.
Oh, Marge, that's a big question. And that's something we were working on actually before I left the state. There was ethnic studies work that was continuing to happen. We had some work happening with our Senate Bill 13 around our tribal history. So there's work that's been happening. I think that the execution of that gets really cumbersome when you're in bureaucratic systems, right? And how do you really take all that really, great work and get it to educators and help them feel comfortable in executing it. And I think that's, they become capacity issues to be able to do that really effectively. So I know those were a lot of conversations that were happening at the state level. So there's work that has been in the process for some time. And even before my time at the state, right? There was work that tireless effort from folks in the community to put together curriculum to really make sure that the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color were centered in our education. And it's just that, how do we get that out, right? And as you know, we have local control, right, in our state with school districts, and so school boards, like there's just there are lots of layers to that become very cumbersome, I think, sometimes unnecessarily. They need to go over the white supremacy culture characteristics. And
there's so many students that are not able to function successfully or feel successful in the current system that we have now. And a lot of the information that the curriculum is way, in my opinion, there's some topics that are relevant, but a lot of it, they're never going to use that information. So I think they need to revamp the whole education system toward what everybody needs today to live in community, to get a job, keep a job, to have a happy life, and to be financially sound. And those things are just kind of left, the financial part is just kind of left in the air for a lot of these people. And then by the time they get 21 or 25, they're underwater and they can't get out. So to me, that's a racial issue.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot we could be doing in how we're educating our children. I have my daughter right now virtually participating in kind of a history of Black folks in America, and she just sort of looked at me and groaned. She was like, but I know these things, like you tell me all the time. I was like, you need to hear from someone else, right? Never hurts to get it in there. So, that's me giving her something, but there, are, I know that I'm fortunate to be able to do that. And, I don't take that for granted, but I know that there, are other parents that are not able to do or offer, right, some of the things that I can offer because of my role as an educator. And, right now, I'm thinking about curriculum, but for me, I'm also concerned about just thinking about school is what we're going to do with this pandemic and sending children back to school. That's a whole nother topic.
Yeah.
At the top of my list, but anyway, I'll hush on that.
Thank you. So Mary had a related question, and maybe you've already addressed this as much as you'd like. Her question is, how do we change the education system to teach our children about Black history?
Yeah, and I think that's the educators have to be educated. They're not getting in their teacher prep programs, right? So they don't get that knowledge. And then they're just sort of, they're stepping into classrooms. They don't have necessarily that knowledge. Or they're not supported if they do, right? Because there's some sort of other rigid structure in place that says what they can and cannot teach. And, we try and do things that are innovative maybe at the state level, but there's, issues in the structure of really having that trickle down. So it just is, we're not doing a good job of connecting the pieces together. And that piece around teacher prep, teacher education programs, I think is really important to think about. So how to, what does that look like for educators? I used to teach the multicultural classes and the diversity classes for educators, and often that was the one or two that they got. Whole 4-year program to become a teacher, maybe 1 or 2 classes, and trying to pour everything that I could into them. And that's not, that's not always enough.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question from Ian. And I kind of share this question. This was a thought that I had. Would making equity a necessary part of a performance evaluation almost force it to be systemic? If you're graded on the equity in your job with your clients and peers, wouldn't that make it a regular practice in life?
Yeah, we're having that conversation now. We were on the verge of releasing a new performance evaluation system at the city, and then COVID happened. And we had to put that on pause, but there were some bureaus that were part of the pilot. And one component, one of many components, but one major component of that evaluation for the first time was really elevating what employees were doing towards equity goals. And, having a supervisor or manager be able to look at that. And these are, a lot of times it's an employee that's filling out kind of, how they feel they've been doing, right? And having that back and forth conversation with the supervisor. But this was the first time in the evaluation system that it was really amplified to the degree that it was. And there was, evidence, right, that folks were, that the evaluator would be looking for to see if the person had attended to that. And so I think the same would be true. Someone saying around teacher evaluations, absolutely. I know that there, have been conversations about what that looks like. And there's often a check the box kind of thing, but I think it has to be really deep, and there has to be ways in which that gets demonstrated, not just numbers, right? But what are some policy or something that you are a part of that could demonstrate a commitment to what that looks like. And we have new city values, and one of them is that, we are, valuing the idea that we want to be against anti-Black racism. Like, we don't want that to be a part of what we do. And so how are we going to make sure we're evaluating people? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Iris would like you to speak to House Bill 2016.
Oh, Iris. I can see her too. Iris can speak to, we can both speak to 2016. We were there from its infancy. So House Bill 2016 is our African-American Black Student Success Plan, passed in the legislature actually in 2015, but work had been happening on it prior to, and had the privilege of working with Iris to see that come to fruition. And really what the intent behind that bill was one, we have a advisory body that came together, drafted a plan that really laid out very clearly, in my very biased opinion, the direction that we needed to go to change what education looks like for Black and African-American students in our education system. And once that plan was written and shared, I think that same sort of piece that I shared around, like, bureaucratically, like, we've got this plan, now how do we make sure it gets into the places that it needs to be, right? That became sort of the next layer of conversation that we were having. But really the intent behind that plan is to give some guidance into some direction for what education can be, should be for our Black and African-American students. And we have, at this point, I think there are 9 still, Iris, grantees. So there are 9 grantees that receive funding as a part of that bill and its passage. And they have been doing work. They work with Black and African-American students in culturally specific community-based organizations, places like ERCO and SEI and REAP and Elevate Oregon. Like, there are, these organizations that have been doing this work in community for a really long time. And these funds are supporting them and continuing to expand and grow that. And they are specifically tied to goals and strategies within that plan that was drafted by our advisory body. And so if folks are interested in more about that, you can talk with Iris or I. We know all about it.
Thank you. Any more questions? Don't be shy.
You have good wait time. I'm so impressed. You're a teacher, Donna? That's like good. I remember it. That's the one thing you do learn in your teacher education program. What's the wait time? I got chastised when I was in my program. Like, Markisha, you didn't wait long enough. I'm like, what? So. Nicole said Nicholas Anderson has a random question.
Is it a relevant random question?
What?
Oh, can you do it in private schools? Like, how would you, like, what would the process be in private schools?
I don't know. I know the structures are different in private schools. So I don't know what that would look like.
I think the leverage is different in private schools
It
as well,
is.
because the tuition payers have a
Yep,
lot more influence.
they do.
Mhm.
And that can be good or bad.
Mhm. Okay. And then that's right. Nancy had a question about your favorite authors around this type of work, and I think also like recreational reading, who you enjoy reading.
Oh, so in this work, I would say Robin DiAngelo is a must for folks in thinking about the work that I've talked about. Ta-Nehisi Coates is both an inspiration in this work and also recreationally. Yes, someone put Dr. Joy DeGruy, absolutely. Another inspirational author. So who else am I reading? For fun right now, nothing much.
There will be no fun. There's no fun.
No fun. I wish, right? I'm trying to think. Maya Angelou will always be at the core. Doesn't matter time or place. Will always be she was actually, I tell people this, she was actually the first Black author that I ever read. And I was in 6th grade. So I didn't know Black folks are writing stuff till 6th grade. So she will always have a special place in my heart for that. So yeah, those are a couple that are coming to mind right now. Glenn Singleton, I like his work. Courageous Conversations About Race.
Glenda has a question. Can you explain the difference between white fragility and shyness?
That's a good question. I would say, how does it show up in a space? So what's the conversation that's happening, right? And how does it show up in the space in terms of like the reactions? Like, what is it that something happens and it's a tough conversation? We're really having this conversation about racism, how it's showing up in our work and what have you. And then there is this moment of white fragility or tears that, so whoever may have raised it, if it's a person of color, is made to feel some sort of guilt because the white individual may be feeling guilt, right? And then there's just this sort of like, now we've got to take care of that. Like, so I think for me, it's like, how is it showing up in a space? Like, what's the context of the conversation? How is it showing up in a space? And then, if it's just shyness or someone not wanting to come forth with something, that's very different, I think, than it totally changing the course of a conversation or having an impact such that we are distracted or taking a detour or kind of going down a different direction that takes us away from the tough conversation that we need to have, right? And the folks that are doing it don't realize that that's what's happening, but that's what's happening, right? I don't want to talk about what's here. And so that emotion in that space then becomes about, nurturing or comforting that individual. And that's not to say that we don't do that, but do we get back to what it was that we were talking about, right? Like, do we get back to that conversation? Sometimes we don't ever get back there because we're in that space of caring for. And I think that's just different than shyness. I think, how is it showing up?
Yeah. So going back to white fragility for a moment, would you say that for people who are working on their own white fragility, that at the extreme end is I react in such a way that everything stops and now revolves around me, and we're trying to walk back from that as white people. We're trying to walk back to, I might be feeling something, but I don't need everybody else to stop. And then walking it back further to, I'm feeling something, but I'm not distressed by it. I can sit with it. And then walking back further to, this doesn't bother me. Would you say that's a kind of a fair progression?
Yeah, I appreciate the way that you articulated it. I think that's that's totally fair. I think that the other thing is, you know, in spaces, and I appreciate that you all have some kind of working community agreements, if you were. I like, you know, I call them community agreements. I don't say norms because, you know, whose norms, right? But agreements, right? So how are we agreeing to be in community? And so I think if you've got that established, particularly in conversations where you know that there, you know, may be some discomfort, or folks may be feeling some sort of way about something, or going to experience that in a particular way, that having those agreements also sort of solidifies how are we holding space for one another in this community, right? What's our agreement around that? And so I like how you articulated that, Donna, right? Like, how can we sort of back that up? And I think if you're an infant in this journey that you're on, that happens. And I think what you need to realize is sort of acknowledging, you know, what the perception of that is for the folks who are also experiencing that. And so that's the part that, you know, comes with time, right? Mm-hmm. So it could be you're having a very emotional reaction to something that you're hearing. But how does that emotional reaction distract from X, Y, and Z? An acknowledgement of that. And that's not to say that people are robots and can't have emotion. That, you know, we have to separate that out. It's like, how does that emotion impact the conversation? Are we having to stop now and we never get back on track? Or is it just, or do we stop? It's too uncomfortable and folks can't handle it. So we're just going to table that for now. That's where we get kind of into the territory that it doesn't push it. We have to push ourselves. Right now, we got to push ourselves. I hate to say it, but it's just the truth. Mm-hmm. We got to push ourselves. And yeah, but thank you, Donna. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Okay, question from Charlene. How do we change the ineffective diversity, cultural sensitivity, and racism as ethical issue trainings? And wouldn't it be better for whites to train whites in regards to their white supremacy and how they recognize it in their person so they can better bring that to the government and other work?
Okay, so a couple things I'm hearing in the question. One, I think we've been working really on our equity training. We have at the city a mandatory equity 101 training. I say mandatory, but there's some folks that have been working for a while that have not taken it. And that's a matter of, you know, what's our tracking look like. But we do have a mandatory equity 101 training. And I think that has slowly, these things can't be static, right? When we create curriculum, we create training or professional learning, it can't be static. Like, it has to continue to be dynamic, and it has to continue to shift and morph and change as the work shifts and morphs and changes. And so that's what we've really committed to for the training that we do that comes out of my office. We're constantly questioning ourselves about, is this the right direction? Have we engaged community in a way that is helping inform the way that we are presenting this to city staff? And so that's a process we're constantly in. And to the second part of that, tell me again, the second kind of piece, Donna.
Okay, wouldn't it be better for whites to train whites in regards to their white supremacy?
So here's a reality I learned in doing the training is that oftentimes this work is received differently when a white colleague presents it. Like I have, I'm not saying, yeah, that should be the way it is, but I understand that happens. And what I have really encouraged folks on my team is we need a diversity of voices. And so I have staff that are white. I have staff that identify as Latinx. There's, my deputy director is African. I have an Asian American. Like we have a diversity of voices that rotate to do the training work that we do. And I think it's important. Yes, while I think it's important for white folks who are in this work to help other white folks get to where they need to be, right? I also think it's valuable for white folks to hear from Black folks like that are, living this, right? Or that folks in our Latinx community, right? Like, so that variety and diversity of voices is really important. And it has to be shared space. And, you know, I think that that's, you know, that's valuable. And I think you also have to assess, like, what is the dynamic that you're going into with a training? We don't often think about, like, well, who's your audience? And not just audience in terms of like how they identify racially, but like, what do they do, right? And you know, that's another thing that we think about. But, and I see a comment like, how do you really begin to sort of deal with some of your discomfort if you don't have somebody that has been living discomfort talk to you about how uncomfortable they are? Absolutely agree. So I think that's important too. So we don't want to just be reliant on that as the only model. So we're very flexible in the voices that we use.
Okay. Dr. Smith, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We've all learned so much tonight. It's just been such a pleasure to talk to you.
I appreciate that. Thank you all. Wonderful to see you, hear you. Thank you for your thoughtful questions and for being here. That makes me smile. So I am more than happy to engage in whatever way again. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us this evening. And if you will be on our mailing list now because you got a ticket to this event. So we'll be letting you know about next month's event, and we hope to see you again. Okay. Please watch for notice of the video being made available as well. And thank you so much for your support.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.